When Police Captain Crawford struck Lieutenant George Wilkins, he didn't realize it was a mistake that would change their lives and the city. Witnesses recorded the moment that marked the fall of an era of impunity, as public outrage and media pressure exposed cracks in the centuries-old system. Lieutenant George Wilkins kept his posture firm, maintaining a steady eye contact with Captain Crawford. The scene was charged, the tension hanging thick in the crisp night air, illuminated only by the glow of streetlights. A soft breeze rustled the fallen leaves, whispering through the silence that now engulfed the street, the only sound being the faint shuffling of shoes and the creaking of leather belts. George clenched his jaw subtly, the muscle in his cheek twitching as he fought to keep his composure. "I'm making it my business, Captain," George asserted, his voice slicing through the quiet like a blade. He could feel the pulse in his temples, his body taut as a wire. The young man's eyes, wide with anxiety and the sheen of unshed tears, darted to George, a silent plea within them. Crawford's nostrils flared as he took a slow, deliberate step toward George, his boots scuffing the concrete with an ominous scrape. The officer beside him shifted uneasily, fingers still poised near the gun, glancing between the two men. "Lieutenant, you're way out of line!" Crawford hissed, his face so close that George could see the fine lines of age and anger etching deep into his brow. George raised a hand, palm outward, signaling a cease in hostility. "There's a way we handle things," he said, his voice measured and low, carrying the authority of experience. "Let's not turn this into something we can't come back from." The air between them crackled as Crawford's jaw clenched, a vein pulsing at his temple. The younger officer's breath came in shallow, tense bursts, his eyes flicking back and forth. George felt the eyes of the detained man, felt the weight of the moment pressing into him, challenging his resolve. Time seemed to slow, each second a battle of wills. Finally, Crawford's lip curled in a snarl before he took a step back, though his gaze remained a dagger. "Watch yourself, Wilkins! You're on thin ice," he muttered, the threat hanging as he turned sharply, his coattails whipping around him as he gestured for the other officer to follow. George released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders slumping slightly in relief. He met the young man's gaze, no longer darting and filled with fear, but locked onto George's with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The street, once filled with tension, now felt quiet, almost serene, but George knew that beneath the surface, the currents of change and resistance were still churning. "Are you all right?" George asked softly, taking a step closer, the streetlights casting long shadows behind them. The young man nodded, hesitant but sincere, a tremble in his exhale. As the officer's footsteps receded, George turned his eyes to the sky, a brief moment of reflection washing over him. This was only one night, one confrontation, but it embodied the battles he knew would not end here. And with that realization, he stood taller, more determined than before. George stood tall, his chest heaving as he fought to regain his breath, feeling the sting of the concrete scrape against his palms. The murmurs of the crowd buzzed around him like an angry swarm. The tension was palpable, an unspoken challenge hanging in the charged air. His eyes met Crawford's, no longer just filled with fury, but now tinged with something else, uncertainty. The crowd's presence was a powerful force, turning what had been a private confrontation into a public spectacle. A young woman in the front row of onlookers, her phone raised, recorded every moment. "This is going live," she called out, her voice steady but laced with urgency. George's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the knowledge that this moment would echo far beyond this darkened street corner. Crawford's expression flickered as the weight of the crowd's attention began to sink in. The rigid set of his jaw relaxed, ever so slightly, as he glanced at the cameras now aimed at him, like a firing squad. His fists uncurled, hands now hanging by his sides, fingers twitching with suppressed rage. The silence stretched thin, taut as a rope about to snap. George took a step forward, lifting his chin, the streetlight casting a sharp shadow across his strong features. "This isn't how we do things," he said, his voice a calm ripple that cut through the whispers. The young man who had been detained stood motionless, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and astonishment. The captain's face hardened again, his pride wrestling with the implications of his actions. George could see it. The struggle of a man who had long been in power, now forced to reconsider his position under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. The younger officer beside him shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between his superior and the crowd, no longer certain where his loyalty should lie. As seconds ticked by, it became clear that Crawford's dominance had been eroded. A police siren wailed faintly in the distance, adding a layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. The crowd's murmur shifted from alarm to something resembling resolve. People exchanged knowing looks, nodding subtly. George squared his shoulders, blood pounding in his ears but eyes unflinching. He knew this was more than just a confrontation between two officers. This was about every silent witness who had ever stood by, unseen and unheard. "We're better than this," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a promise. Thomas Reynolds' presence added a new gravity to the scene. His sharp eyes scanned the area, assessing the dynamics at play. The nervous glances of officers, the defiance and resolve etched into George Wilkins' face, and the collective anticipation in the crowd. The shouts of justice and no more cover-ups echoed off the buildings, a spontaneous anthem of defiance. George steadied himself, the dull throb in his chest grounding him in the present. He met Reynolds' gaze briefly, reading the silent acknowledgement there, a tacit agreement that the night's events would mark a shift in the status quo. Turning back to Crawford, who stood paralyzed, George's voice cut through the commotion once more. "This is the end of unchecked power," he declared, the intensity of his words resonating with the crowd and sparking another wave of cheers. Crawford's jaw twitched, as if searching for words, but none came. The seasoned captain's bravado had cracked, leaving only a man faced with the public revelation of his misdeeds. The officer at his side, once rigid in solidarity, now took another step back, clearly distancing himself from his superior's fate. Reynolds finally broke the silence, his voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "Captain Crawford, you will be temporarily relieved of duty pending an investigation. Cooperate or I'll ensure your compliance by any means necessary." The implication sent a shudder through the gathered officers, their eyes shifting between the captain and Reynolds. The crowd roared its approval, chants growing louder, their collective energy suffusing the air. Wilkins felt the surge of empowerment ripple through him, a confirmation that standing firm in the face of corruption wasn't in vain. He exchanged a look with the young man who had been the original target of Crawford's aggression. The man's eyes glistened with relief, shoulders relaxing as hope took hold where fear once resided. As Reynolds signaled for two uniformed officers to escort Crawford to the waiting police car, the crowd shifted, parting to let them through, but not without continuing their cries for accountability. Crawford's face, pale and lined with defeat, passed under the harsh illumination of the streetlights as he was led away, a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. George stood tall, his eyes tracing the scene, the noise of the crowd filling the once silent street. He knew that tonight would not erase years of distrust and systemic issues, but it was a start. It was a moment that, captured on hundreds of phones and witnessed by dozens, would echo beyond this night. Reynolds, having ensured the captain's departure, turned to George and nodded once, a small but significant gesture. The tension began to break, replaced by a newfound sense of unity among the onlookers. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were part of the change. The video of the incident, recorded on witnesses' phones, quickly spread across social media and reached major news outlets. Reports detailed every aspect of the clash, from Captain Crawford's violent strike to Lieutenant George Wilkins' unflinching stance. Public outrage grew daily, intensifying the debate over systemic bias and police violence. Protests and peaceful demonstrations became a fixture in the city, with people holding signs calling for justice and reform. George, now officially promoted to captain, addressed the public in a statement. Standing before flags and cameras, he spoke with a conviction that resonated deeply. "Today, we stand on the brink of change. What happened on these streets was wrong, but it has sparked something greater, a flame of justice and hope. I urge each of you not to rest until we see real changes in our system." Crawford, temporarily suspended, awaited disciplinary proceedings and sought to justify his actions through legal representation. But his reputation was shattered, and the weight of public pressure made further resistance futile. Meanwhile, the city's residents rallied behind George, organizing events of solidarity. Families, students, and activists gathered to demonstrate that the call for equality and justice had become a shared goal. Internal reviews and a new level of civilian oversight became a reality, signaling the end of an era of impunity. George Wilkins became not only a symbol of justice, but also a living testament to the power of fighting for change. His courage inspired thousands to believe that the struggle for equal rights was worthwhile, and that each person's efforts could contribute to a larger movement for justice.